Hello, and welcome to Growth Unbound, where we delve deep into the multifaceted journey of growth within the world of startups and scale ups. This is where we unpack the complex intersection of people dynamics, business strategy, organizational design, and the ever evolving tech landscape. Our mission is to unchain your company's growth potential by understanding and navigating these intricate systems and helping you overcome the hidden challenges that could stand in your way. I'm your host, Nada El-Kadi, and I've spent over 20 years working and helping organizations navigate these complexities and drive sustainable growth. In this episode, we're going to dig into a term many of us in the tech world are familiar with, tech debt. We're also going to introduce its often overlooked cousin, operational debt. We'll talk about what these terms mean, why they are critical for leaders and startups and scale-ups to understand, and what can be done to manage and mitigate their impact. It's a conversation that's rarely had, but absolutely necessary in today's dynamic business environment. Today, we have a very, very special guest joining us, a friend and a former colleague of mine, David Haney. David is currently the Senior Director of Engineering at Stack Overflow. He was previously a leader on Fanatics' e-commerce platform, which hosts over 10,000 websites, including NFLshop.com and NBAstore.com. David is passionate about distributed systems and scaling high-traffic web applications, and his current side project, as if that wasn't enough, is codesession.io, an app that offers free IDE-like coding interviews. Now, David has absolutely navigated the complex road to growth as a senior engineering leader, and he's experienced firsthand the trials, triumphs, and transformations that go hand in hand with rapid scaling. He brings a wealth of knowledge and insights on today's topic. So without further ado, David, welcome to Growth Unbound.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you again, Nada. It's been a while.
It's good to see you. It's great to have us with you today. Let's dig right into this tech debt that all of us kind of seem to talk about, know, but maybe not fully understand. It's a common term. I remember hearing it tossed around a lot, but in your own words, from your perspective, what does it mean to you and how would you define it?
It's a tough question to answer, but I will definitely do my best. I think that the catch with tech debt is that it's kind of a term that has 1,000 meanings, and the meaning often differs between each organization. To me, I've always seen tech debt as the sort of unspoken and maybe unmeasured amount of cruft and overhead that naturally is produced when you're writing applications using code. Ultimately, we're humans, and humans are nowhere near perfect, no matter how hard we try. And so while you try to write the best and most efficient and optimized code you can, undoubtedly you will add some level of overhead and unnecessary or rigid lines of code in doing so. And that is the stuff that I would call tech debt, essentially, is the things that were done. There's lots of reasons why. Sometimes you need to move quick, and that's a deliberate decision. And so in moving quick, you don't necessarily take the time to write the most optimal or efficient code. There's a million other reasons it comes up, but often it's just the organic amount of kind of sediment that gets sprinkled into code as you naturally write it.
Yeah. And so when you say it's just natural sediment that is a part of writing code, when you say writing code, are we talking about code for products that companies sell? Is it code for back-end systems? What is the code for?
Yeah, now that I think about it, it's not even necessarily just code. You can have all kinds of infrastructure and architectural tech debt as well in how you set up your systems and scale them. But in terms of code, I think anything and everything. I've seen tech debt in Windows applications and desktop applications. I've seen it in video games, seen it in mobile apps, websites, you name it. Anything that, if you're going to write some code for something, you're going to ultimately generate some tech debt as well.
Yeah. What does tech debt look like to someone on the outside? How would they know that this application or this system is accruing tech debt?
I think that's the hardest part about it, and why it's such a pervasive issue is it's often invisible. the analogy I like to give is if you think of plumbing, where you transport water, usually to households or businesses through a pipe, you see that the pipe is there. And in this case, the pipe is the application or the website or whatever, but you don't see the insides of it. And the insides can be caked up with all kinds of stuff restricting the efficient flow of water, so to speak. And so I think that you don't ever really see tech debt if you're not a programmer in the day-to-day or other, other engineering or software professional in the day-to-day work where the tech debt is generated directly and looking at it yourself. But you often see the kind of smells or symptoms of tech debt manifest, and those can be unnecessary and unforeseen complications and long estimates and things just not moving efficiently or taking way longer and being way more expensive than you might anticipate or expect.
Hmm. You mentioned earlier that we're human. So if we're writing code, then obviously it's not going to be perfect. And sometimes you got to move fast. Um, those are some ways I'm guessing tech debt happens. But if we were to zoom out a little bit more, how would you describe the process by which tech debt occurs?
I think it's a natural product of any one programmer writing code. And so what tends to happen is it amplifies and gets orders of magnitude worse generally as your organization scales. So it's very hard to keep everybody aligned, and alignment is a big part of an executive or senior manager's job. And in aligning people, because again, we're humans, not everybody's going to get the exact same message or
Mhm.
operate in the exact same way, nor do we expect them to, because diversity of thought and approach is definitely a superpower for most organizations. So I think that assumptions are almost always inherently made at some level when
Mm.
following directions. And as a result of that, you end up creating tech debt, usually through lack of communication and alignment, and also deliberate analysis and study. So to that end, I think what a lot of organizations do is they don't actually take the time to properly measure and quantify tech debt. And that's because it's really difficult to do so. It's
Mm.
very hard to put an exact number on how much it's costing you in terms of time or money or both, or
Got
any
it.
other measure really.
Right. So interesting. So it seems like it starts with the alignment, right? Here's this thing that we're building, and forgive me because I don't have the engineering experience, obviously. But hey, we're going to write code for this thing. We're building this feature. We're building this system. There's code that already exists that operates a certain way. We need to make sure that we blank, right? And so whatever that blank direction that's given, naturally there are going to be assumptions, there are going to be interpretations, and there are going to be takeaways that engineers are going to be taking away and then applying in their work.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
it's a lot like a good example I like to give is next time you want to have a fun meeting at work, grab 6 or 7 developers in a room and ask them, give them all a sheet of paper and a pen and ask them to draw an elephant. It's as simple as that. You will not get the same picture exactly or
Mhm.
even near exactly. You will get very different interpretations because fundamentally the organizational issue is that everybody applies different understanding to different terms. And so you will get different code in the same way.
Got it. So it seems like one big, I guess, category or bucket of how tech debt is gets created is through these different interpretations, different assumptions, maybe lack of alignment, right? Are there other ways that tech debt can get created?
Certainly. Sometimes it's lack of skill or incorrect application of skill, and that's certainly not an insult to any developer out here listening. I think that developers tend to lie in a large spectrum of ability and skill set, and they tend to traverse along that spectrum through their career. So we all start out as a junior or very new developer, and that's probably when we're going to create the most tech debt in some ways because we write inefficient code. But
Mm.
then as we get a little more skilled and experienced in our career, we create a new form of tech debt, which is over engineering, which is a classic developer trap, if you will,
Yeah,
where you try to make your code so flexible and so open to modification and future features that you actually build 5 times the code you need to get a simple thing done.
Got it.
And then as you approach the final part of the spectrum where you meet your real, 95th percentile developers and up, that's where these people tend to pragmatically marry what needs to be done with exactly how complicated or simple the code should remain in accomplishing it. And that's a
That,
much harder thing that not
yeah,
everybody develops the skills for
it's
adequately.
it sounds like there's a almost like a balancing act that almost inherently comes with where you are in your experience and career trajectory. That's just part of the process.
It's also a mentorship problem. I think that if there isn't somebody in a key position who can provide guidance on how things should be done, and to be clear, should be done is not a one true path, it's relative to the company or the context that you're in. If there isn't a leader who's providing how to do things correctly, then everybody's going to do things what they feel is correctly, which again is very
Mm.
subjective.
So just giving that context as a mentor, as a leader to guide, hey folks, this is how we want to do things here. And it's sounds like it's just general guidelines. And within that context can be the individual interpretations that don't kind of veer off too far away from the direction that was given.
Yeah, I would even call them like coding standards or engineering best practices. And I think that to do that correctly, you don't overprescribe and you don't underprescribe. You don't give
Mm,
people exactly step-by-step instructions on what to do because that's impossible. And
mm,
also because it becomes very complicated very quickly. You also don't give people very little to go on because then you get all kinds of outputs and different standards. And I think that the best coding standards and best practices tend to give the 80% of general large broad strokes, like here's how we do things and want to do things, here's how you build a service, here's how you stand up a website, here's how you write a method, and here's how you test a method, and then leaves the other 20% open to best effort interpretation. But ultimately when you mash, there's always some level of ambiguity, either in the
right,
person's knowledge and understanding or in the thing to be done, because often we're also creating new things, or else we would just buy or acquire the things that already exist.
right,
And so whenever you're treading that new path, there's going to be an amalgamation of sort of different approaches that when smashed together to complete an application, create some form of tech debt.
right. I also remember many times throughout my career working in startups and scale ups that a lot of times tech debt gets created uh, because we're moving fast, because there's no time really to sit down and think about how do we want to build this thing to scale. We just got to build this thing now. So a lot of times, from my experience as a a technical person, as a non-engineer, that when things are done ad hoc, really, really quickly, that tends to also create tech debt.
I often refer to it as the iron triangle. There's 3 points on it, good, fast, and cheap. And if you pick two, it costs you the other one. A lot of organizations, sometimes for good reason and sometimes for not so good reason, will choose to do things fast and cheap. And so they don't come out that good. There are reasons that might be valid to do this, like being a first to market mover, which could be a a significant advantage for entrepreneurial efforts or startups. There can be bad reasons for doing that, such as cost cutting or cost saving, which always sounds good on paper at the bottom line, but is often a mass creator of tech debt for certain. And I think that ultimately companies, the startup mantra tends to be move fast and break things. And I think that in moving fast, you break a lot of things and then you need to take the time to clean it up. And if you don't, you've accumulated tons of tech debt.
Right. So moving fast and breaking things uh, can help create this pile of tech debt. Inherently trying to balance interpretation, assumptions, over engineering, under engineering, all of these seem to contribute to tech debt. It's almost part and parcel of it's the nature of the beast,
Yeah.
right?
If
Like,
I write an app by myself, I'm creating tech debt. It starts with one person. Like I write my own app code session and I've created tons of tech debt that I still haven't paid down because I'm moving fast. One developer creates tons of tech debt. You don't need other people.
and how does that happen?
Ultimately, I write the best code that I can at the time that I am creating. And then later I learn new and better things and better ways of doing things. And I need to revisit and optimize.
It's so interesting. I almost feel like in that case, I wouldn't call it tech debt. I'd call it tech opportunity or something like that, because it's not so much that the application, this lone engineer created is going to break down as much as it is, hey, there's other ways you can do things that will allow you to do more with it or do different things with it that maybe you didn't know about before.
I think tech debt is very muddy in definition, as we talked about, and I think that there is some line somewhere that differentiates tech debt and almost opportunity cost.
Mm,
And so sometimes you've written a method that works perfectly fine, but it turns out that maybe there's a newer technology or service or way to write the code that could save you a lot of money. And so it's not necessarily urgent. It's not contributing negatively to the code base,
mm.
but it could be contributing suboptimally to the bottom line of the company. So it's worth revisiting and rewriting the method to make it more efficient.
So, almost in a sense, tech debt, I think we naturally associate the word debt as being something bad, negative, not good. You don't want it, right? But then I'm almost instantly reminded, especially in the world of business, there's good debt and there's bad debt, right? There's the kind of debt that you do want to have, you know, um, financially, and then there's the debt you don't want to have. And it seems like this is similar to tech debt. It's not a bad thing as much as it's a thing that we need to see, acknowledge, understand, figure out. And yes, there are ways that it gets built up over time simply because of lack of alignment, communication, assumptions, interpretations, or moving fast and breaking things, or neglecting to take a look at choices and opportunity costs. So it seems like there are different ways that tech debt can get created. So I guess now I'm wondering, okay, so can we ever eliminate tech debt, or is it just a matter of figuring out how to see it, manage it, and mitigate it?
I think that it's an unavoidable consequence of creative art, right? And so programming is as much creative as it is scientific. It's not just understanding the logic and how to write code, but it's how to write the code in a way that's beautiful. And when I say beautiful, I mean like very simple, easy to understand, easy to maintain, doesn't fall over, tends to follow the solid principles. And even the best programmers in the world, of which I would not call myself one, are going to write code that creates tech debt because it's just impossible to be perfect 100% of the time. And the reason for that is especially sort of intuitive if you think about it in terms of time as a linear scale. So at the time that I write the code, I might have written the best, most optimal code possible. And then 3 months, 6 months, a year later, there's a new framework or new technology or a new way of doing things that's been discovered that makes it even better. And now I have tech debt simply because I didn't keep up.
Mm,
So it comes in many, many forms. It comes from a lack of experience. It comes from too much experience and over engineering, as you said, all those things and more. I think that, the fundamental point is even if I control for all other organizational values and I myself go and write an application, which is exactly what I did with Code Session, there's a bunch of tech debt in that application as well, right? In the form of not keeping libraries up to date, in the form of, again, methods that might be more costly than they should be and everything else. So truly, to me, it's an unavoidable facet of programming and one that doesn't get enough diligence and effort put in general towards resolving or mitigating.
right. And it seems like uh it's something that needs to be embraced, right? It's gonna happen. It's just
It's
part,
not a swear word.
right.
It's
It's
just a part of the game.
it's a part of the game. We need to embrace it. We need to zoom out and see it and accept it. And then we need to manage it. And kind of like you said earlier, we have a tendency not to quantify or measure it. So if you can't quantify or measure it, how can you manage it? So, what are some ways that we can quantify and measure tech debt?
It's a difficult question. I think that it's a very intangible thing because it's never really, sometimes it's a smoking gun, like this app keeps falling over and exploding, so we need to fix it, right? And that tends to get prioritized because it's costing the company something. But often tech debt is this amassing of thousands of little decisions over time that create one big complicated system that is difficult to reason about and even more difficult to add code to or features to. And so I think that what I try to do, rather than, I don't think that you can quantify tech debt directly. What I try to do is partner with organizations, particularly the product side of the house, and try to pitch to them a case for taking time to clean up an area of tech debt that is like high value or high priority. And I try to quantify that in terms of expected outputs. So for example, recently I went to the product org at Stack Overflow and I said, there's this part of our code base that handles authentication that's really in bad shape. I would like to take a month to rewrite it. And, product immediately has kind of a visceral reaction because what you're sort of saying in non-technical speak is, I want you to get no product features for a month and no productivity for a month, which is always a hard sell.
Right.
And so you have to come at it with value. So then I come to them and I say, and in doing this, what you should expect is 20 to 25% faster feature work going forward in that area as a result of the code being simpler to reason about and to extend. And then you start to measure that. You measure, things like cyclomatic complexity of your code, but you also measure like agile concepts like cycle time and flow. And when you start to understand those values, you have a baseline and you can sort of, it's pseudoscience, but you can sort of quantify how the work that you put towards repairing and improving the state of your technical code or architecture or infrastructure can then contribute to those things happening in a more efficient way, getting more stuff done faster with less effort, fewer unexpected spikes or blown estimates, maybe shorter estimates in general. There are a couple ways to measure it, but I would really encourage people to see tech debt as largely as a black box that you can never really open. And so instead of trying to disambiguate it, try to measure the outputs that it affects and then show that changing the tech debt improves them.
So interesting. It's almost as if what you're looking at are the outcomes. What's happening, right? What is the
Exactly.
state of what's so? Sometimes it's a smoking gun. So it's obvious something is breaking down. Holy crap. All right, we need to look at this thing, right? And what's the expected output? That's not happening. Okay, we need to
Yeah, simple
investigate.
case.
Simple
Website's
case,
going down 10
right?
times a day because a batch job's failing. That's high
Yeah,
priority, got to fix it, and it's pretty easy to measure that it
right.
improved things. But it's
Something's
not always
happening.
that easy.
Right. Well, yeah, of course. Um, and so there's that, right? But that's the most obvious. But then it sounds like being a little bit more proactive and doing almost like a regular audit, like the example you gave about going to the product org and partnering with them to take the time to clean up some of the code for a particular application. It looks like smoking gun, regularly audit things, applications, and look for what are we getting, what are we supposed to be getting, and see if it's lining up. If it's not, okay, then let's take a look into this. I think part of what I'm hearing as this like proactive audit is also how can we do things better, right? And you mentioned how even as a solo engineer building his or her own application, right? Maybe there's a new technology, a new language, something new that you can incorporate. That seems like it's how do we build on this? So it seems like tech debt, like you said, is this black box, and the black box has things that maybe are obvious and blaring, like the smoking gun or the application breaking down, and maybe just take a look through, sift through every once in a while. Be proactive, anticipate things happening, take a look at outcomes versus expected outputs or outcomes, and let's figure it out. And another way is like, let's look at growth. Is this going to help us scale? Is there something new that we can add that will make it more efficient? So did I get that right? Am I looking at the am I interpreting what you're saying, or as my son would say, am I picking up what you're putting down?
I think so. I think that fundamentally, the best way that I have found to be successful in tackling tech debt is to do two things. One is to ask the people who know where the pain is, which is the developers and the engineers, and they know exactly what's bad in the code base, and they will be able, if you say, if I go to my devs and I say, give me a list of the 10 worst parts of our code that we should improve, it'll be done in 2 hours and it'll be very uniformly agreed upon and universally accepted. They know where the pain is. But the hard part is selling that, so to speak, to the product counterparts, because ultimately you are asking them to make a trade-off. And the trade-off is product features or development that could make them more money very tangibly versus infrastructure and code work that doesn't seem to make them any money at all and actually pauses feature development.
Right.
And so in doing that, you have to have a compelling value story and so or a value proposition. And so for me, I find the best thing you can do is figure out what matters to product and the company on the whole in
Right.
terms of what to measure. Usually, for Stack Overflow, it's things like monthly active and monthly engaged users, not rocket science. We want to make sure that people are coming to the site and using it. And so with that as a baseline, then I can frame tech debt as if we start to work on this part of the code base, we should be able to simplify, for example, signups, which might get you more monthly active users. And that's the hypothesis that we can test by doing this 2 or 3 weeks of work. So speaking the language of the company rather than the technical language
Yeah.
is a key to success as well.
So it's introducing this holistic perspective, even though this tech debt is experienced firsthand by the engineers in the systems and applications that they're building. It's still nonetheless impacting other things, average monthly
Everything.
user, everything, right? The business itself, whether it's the product, whether it's the whatever KPIs you're looking at. I think you mentioned average monthly users, or I may be making that up.
Monthly active users. Yep.
Monthly active users, right? So it sounds like this holistic perspective is, hey, okay, we're measuring this thing, we're looking at it. This is the baseline we should be having. It's not there. Here's the opportunity cost if we don't address it. Here's the value it will bring if we do address it. And let's look at it still through the eyes, through the vantage point of the growth of the entire company. Right?
Exactly.
It's not, it seems like it has a tendency to only live within the engineering department, when in reality, or maybe engineering and product sometimes, when in reality it's everyone, it's all of us.
It impacts every organization I've ever seen. It impacts almost every facet of it in subtle ways. It
Yeah.
impacts finance with the bottom line and how inefficient things are. It impacts sales with lead times on features and expected delivery of optimizations and whatever they've promised in their most recent contracts. It affects marketing because marketing needs a predictable launch date in
Right.
order to be able to actually plan around and create a
Right.
campaign.
Right.
It impacts the executives because often, let's face it, they have bonuses tied around delivering things on schedule. It
Right.
impacts everybody.
Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you didn't have the authority or the decision making ability to kind of put a stake in the ground and say, we need to work on this thing, this tech debt, because it's going to impact us in this way? I mean, have you ever been in that situation before? What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, I've been in it multiple times, both as a developer and as a manager. As a developer, I think any healthy culture, organizational culture, is going to allow developers to speak up about things that are not going right, or for anybody to speak up about things that are not going right in general. It's probably a very healthy thing to have. But having said that, I don't know if it's authority so much, that is a concern here, but I think priority is the thing that I would actually focus on. So what I find often happens is people are willing to listen to what's expressed from either a developer or a manager about what's not going well. Like, hey, we've got a lot of tech debt built up and that's costing us a lot of dev time and makes all the features slower and causes way more bugs and our code is a little less predictable because it's not very unit testable, and wouldn't it be great if we took time to fix that too?
Yeah.
People want to hear that,
Yeah.
but they don't necessarily prioritize it. And that's where the missing link is the partnership with product and the value proposition, the sales pitch, if you will, from engineering of not just, hey, like what I used to do, good example, what I used to do as a developer is I get upset about code that wasn't efficient. And I go to the management product, I say, we need to fix this code. It's inefficient. And they heard me, but they didn't care.
Right.
And I used to be frustrated they didn't care, but it took me a little while in management to figure out that they don't care because I didn't give them a reason why. I didn't
Right.
connect the dots to
Or
why it matters.
what to do about it too.
Yeah, how to fix it I wasn't
Yeah.
conveying,
Yeah.
right? Coming up with a plan in advance could be helpful. Like, hey, we should fix this and here's how I would do it and here's what it leads to,
Yeah.
right? You need to give value propositions to company executives and to managers in order for them
Yeah.
to prioritize. And so I really see it less as a thing about authority and more of a thing about sort of value propositions and priority. You need to give
Yeah.
them a reason to prioritize the work.
Yeah, and I like that you use the term sales pitch, because yes, we are selling our perspective on what we think is important and should be a priority, right?
Exactly.
Whether we sit in engineering or we sit in marketing or product or finance or HR, everyone's trying to put forth, hey, this thing is important because. And I think a lot of times in startups and scale ups, the initiatives that get prioritized are not necessarily prioritized because they are the things that the company needs right now, whether short term, long term, but put through the lens of what's important for the company's growth. But a lot of times, rather, what we see is, again, depending on the larger context, who has the loudest voice, who has the biggest pull. Maybe it's like, nope, we're prioritizing sales because we need to grow that revenue number. We need to see that 20% year over year growth. And there's this assumption that things are prioritized because of certain reasons, when in reality, like you said, everything impacts everything. So engineering, the code, the product, all of these, the tech debt is going to influence certain elements of the business, which will impact that revenue number, for example, that people are looking at. So it seems like this is definitely something that's prevalent across companies. The prioritization. How do we prioritize? And it seems like somehow it needs to link back to this alignment, not just from a coding perspective, but from an organizational perspective. What's important to the org? What are we working towards? What are we prioritizing because we're working towards that? Right. And where do we go from here? And how do we make sure that we're constantly looking into this black box or this operational system and ensuring that we are effectively dealing with fires and at the same time proactively anticipating them, and proactively keeping an eye out for things that we can take on that in the long run would be a huge opportunity cost.
I think that a key thing with tech debt is also in the bureaucracy of the organization. So tech debt also can be an easier pitch in a smaller organization. If you're working
Yeah.
with a group of 4 people, it's pretty easy to get everybody in a room ad hoc and say, hey, this is starting to fall over, we should fix it. And
Right.
it's important to fix, because another analogy I like to give is like living in a home. If you don't kind of do the preventative maintenance stuff on the regular, eventually
Right.
you find yourself in a house that's ready to fall over.
Right.
And if you're building an apartment complex, you got to get that foundation right before you stack layer after layer on top of it, which is
Right.
maybe a more apt analogy for software, because that tends to be how we do things. Now, having said that, when you get to a larger organization, or even that same organization, but it's becoming successful and it's growing and you're taking on more things, you tend to get a little more bureaucracy. And I don't use bureaucracy as a bad word per se, but often it can be challenging.
Yeah.
And you get layers of management. And so what happens is, even if a developer is empowered or authorized to express what's not going right, it could be that the manager at that level doesn't hear it or communicate it correctly. It could be that their manager doesn't hear it or communicate it correctly. It could be that product doesn't hear it or communicate it correctly. And the lines
Right.
of the organization themselves kind of accrue their own sort of debt, like tech debt. And the
Mm,
processes that you used to use, like getting 5 people in a room to figure out what needs to be done, no longer work in a company of 50 or 100.
right. Absolutely. And I love that you brought that up, because context absolutely plays a role and has an impact in how you handle issues like tech debt, right? So, like you said, if you're a small org, yeah, 4 people, you could probably tackle it. You start to grow, you start to scale, things start to get a little bit complex. Things like a bureaucratic ways of being just start to show up naturally, organically. If you don't address them, they can also grow and fester. And this is a perfect segue into the tech debt's cousin, which I like to call operational debt. And it's a metaphor that I like to use for inefficiencies and breakdowns and suboptimal processes and outcomes that accumulate over time in an organization, and that also impact an organization's ability to function and grow and achieve its objectives. And you actually brought it up right now, like even other functions in an org can have their own issues with processes that they had put together that are no longer working as they scale, right? So, we there are obviously going to be symptoms of that underlying causes. And it'll be interesting to look at operational debt and its parallels with tech debt and think about what is it? How do we handle it? What do we do with it? And how do we navigate it so that it's something that has a name, right? Something that's recognized, kind of like tech debt. You mentioned like having with your house, right? There are regular maintenance issues that you need to attend to, and if you don't, then over time stuff's going to start breaking down in your home, right? If we don't do the dishes are going to pile up in the sink. You're not going to have any dishes left to cook or eat with, and you're going to get, bugs and roaches and whatever. So like something as simple as that is, can show us how not taking care of the little things over time can cause bigger problems. So I'm curious, and I know you and I kind of briefly talked about operational debt. Based on everything we just talked about and the things the examples you gave, and the definition I just gave, what were some of your first thoughts when we introduced the term operational debt?
I think it's interesting. I think it's basically organizational tech debt, right?
Mm,
In the same way that tech debt is invisible and hard to quantify, the bureaucracy that gets installed as organizations scale, and again, like you said, it's intuitively installed or even necessarily and naturally installed. It's installed to try and imply a sense of uniform control because that's what it promises. But the thing is, the processes and procedures that you would use in a team of say 10 people may not even work for a team of 20,
yeah,
right? And a practical example, when I first started Stack Overflow as a smaller company, much smaller company, maybe sub 100 employees, and now we're at 500 plus.
yeah.
And I used to have this weekly meeting with all of my reports, and we would all just get together for an hour and talk through what's going on. And then one day I woke up and I had 24 direct reports, which, side note, is way too many for a manager, but I digress. That meeting no longer works. Too
Right,
many people in the room, too
right,
many lines of communication. It was just unsustainable. And so I had to come up with a new way to accomplish the same goal, which is to keep everybody informed about what everybody else is doing. And it's sort of invisible. It's sort of visible to, again, like the programmer seeing the tech debt, the people in the meeting are seeing that the meeting now sucks and isn't working very well.
right,
But to other people in the company, they have no idea. They're not
right,
attending the meeting and they're not staring at the code. And so
right.
there was like, to me, that's kind of an example of like what I would intuitively call operational debt that I had to figure out. And maybe, and then I solved it. And the way I solved it was to back off the meeting to a lesser cadence and to make it a little more asynchronous so that
Yeah,
people would kind of fill everything out in advance.
right.
But then even that fell over a year or two later as we got
Sure.
even more people.
Right,
So
right.
it's just an ongoing firefight in the same way that tech debt is for sure.
Right, right. It's so interesting because you mentioned how when the meetings stopped working as you started to scale, the expected outputs you weren't getting anymore, right? When you had the meeting with all those people, the meeting started to suck. You probably weren't getting the results you needed to get. So you went back, you modified, and you changed things up, and you used a new strategy. And even that over time might not work anymore. So it's interesting how you applied almost a very similar approach that you shared earlier with how you address and tackle tech debt to this, you know, seemingly inconsequential meeting format that you had, right?
Uh,
When in reality, had you ignored the suckiness of the meeting with all these people and you just kept doing it by default because it was on the calendar, that could have led to um, tech debt increasing unnecessarily. It could have led to, I guess, folks in the company or in the team uh, feeling demoralized. Maybe things not getting done. Maybe people, bitching and moaning about it. But it seems like the parallels, I just like the parallels between how you would address tech debt and how you address something like a meeting no longer working because of elements, inputs, I guess, that are changing.
I think they're basically the same. The approach is the same. So in tech debt, it's hard to measure, so you measure the outputs and try to improve them. In operational debt, it's the same. The
Yeah.
output of that meeting was everybody knew what everybody else was up to and I could unblock people. And then eventually that stopped happening.
Right.
So the measured output of everybody being informed got worse.
Yeah.
So I had to find a way to make it better. And so the value proposition to the team instead of to the organization was, hey, let's rebuild this meeting. And I tried to give them input. How would you like it to work? What would be good for you? Because also it's good to consult the people that things impact directly as much as
Right.
possible, which itself can be a form of operational debt. Because how do you talk to everybody when you get into a super huge company?
Right. It almost seems like, and I'm just oversimplifying this, but it almost seems like we're looking at a series of inputs and outputs, or a world of inputs and outputs. What are
Always.
what are we doing? What are we getting? Is the
Exactly.
is the
Cause and
thing
effect.
is the thing
Hypothesis, experiment.
is the thing we're getting the thing we want to get? Is it not? Okay, then let's work backwards. What's going on? What's going on? Audit. And sometimes we audit when there's a smoking gun. Sometimes we audit shortly before that, and sometimes we audit long before. Um, I've also heard many times the people using the word band-aid, right? We just need to band-aid that issue right now because what's more important is we just need to get X, right? So band-aided, we know it's a short-term fix, just fix it now because we have a board meeting next month. We need to have this thing done, or we need to have this certain KPI met. So just band-aid it for now and we'll fix it later. What kinds of operational issues have you experienced being band-aided as a leader or even as a individual contributor?
Many is the short answer. I think, a recent example that comes to mind is strategy and goal setting.
Mm,
So something we've been talking about at Stack Overflow is how we can help product and engineering work even more effectively together. And one thing we realized is that product sets their own goals and strategy and engineering sets their own goals and strategy, and they don't really talk about it. And then they go to work together and they have conflicting priorities. They have conflicting motivations and conflicting
yeah.
goals,
Yeah.
right? Not always. Sometimes they tend to be similar, but if product is trying to prioritize getting features built because many reasons, investors, shareholders, board meetings, quarterly outputs, whatever you name it, promises to big clients, whatever, it
Yeah.
happens.
Seen it all.
And tech and engineering is prioritizing fixing the code because they think it's going to contribute to those things even more so. But then you get in the same room and try to zipper your priorities together, you'll find that they conflict.
Right.
And so the hard thing there is, again, debugging it, because it's kind of, in that case, it's a little more clear cut. It's kind of like the smoking gun, like, oh, what we should do is we should align product engineering to the same goals and outcomes,
Right.
because then they'll naturally get together and corroborate about it. They'll figure it out. But then there are other things like policies, I think is a good one. There's
Mm,
often like policies that work for a while and then they don't. There's meetings that classically work for a while and then they don't. There's even like onboarding and hiring, like humans don't scale, right? That's the fundamental thing. That's why we write software, is to sort of amplify and multiply the effect and impact we can have. And so anything that involves a human, which is everything, fundamentally reaches a breaking point of scale. And as that happens, you have to try and evolve new and better ways to do it. But often it can't be super easily measured. Like good example, cultural surveys of your organization, yearly surveys or monthly surveys or whatever. How do people feel about your company? Well, if that starts going down, if your employees are like, oh, things are terrible and it's getting worse and worse, like
yeah.
you can't really point to a specific thing usually. It's not like,
Right.
oh, some terrible person works here and makes everybody sad. Like it's usually a very complicated system of interconnected and rigid things.
Yes.
And then you have to step back and say, well, what are we trying to measure as the output, which is employee morale and happiness? And then what things can we pay down within the organization and how we do things to make that better, right?
Right.
Removing bureaucracy is always a winner.
Yeah.
It's difficult, but it's
Yeah.
usually pays for itself. And I think that that's kind of the same approach is these things tend to be very nebulous because they are not a single fact. They are an aggregate set of individual decisions and processes that come together to make the sum of their parts worse,
Right.
right? In the same way that people like to say be more than the sum of the parts, tech debt and organizational debt and operational debt can kind of be more the sum of their parts in a bad way as well.
Right.
And so you have to try and figure out how to disassemble pieces of it a little bit at a time. And because it's nebulous, you kind of focus on the outcomes and outputs instead of the actual.
Mm.
It's not always worth trying to figure out exactly what's going wrong. It's often worth trying to figure out what levers you can pull to make it better.
Yeah. So then what would you recommend leaders do to navigate the natural accruing of operational debt? And we'll bucket tech debt right into that category.
Yeah.
Since it seems to be just part of the growth process.
Tech debt is to code what I would say operational debt is to organizations as they both grow and you make the more complicated things get worse naturally.
Right. Right.
I think that the advice I would give is simple but difficult to execute on, and that's to listen and make space for feedback.
Mm.
If you're not listening to people and you don't create a space where they feel comfortable telling you what's going wrong, then they're not going to, because they don't want to risk their jobs trying to do the right thing if they think they're going to be punished. So you have to create a space or a mechanism or a system. It can be done in lots of ways: anonymous surveys, feedback, even just trust, building trust, and then talking to your employees and saying what's not going well. You have to get that information, and you yourself may have a view of it from whatever point you have in the organization, but always, again, like tech debt, go to the people closest to the pain and ask them what sucks, and they'll have a laundry list, right? And so when I asked my team about that meeting, they were all like, yeah, this is terrible now, sort of uniformly. This is not working. Well, that's an easy sell. Great. I can, the value is I can improve it and everybody will be happier, but how do I improve it? And that's
Right.
where no one person usually has all the answers, self included, of course. And so you
Yeah.
really kind of almost need to crowdsource it. Go talk to people and say, how would you fix it? And you might see that everybody has a different view, which
Yeah.
is, a much more complicated issue, or you might see that certain patterns and themes emerge.
Yeah.
Like, oh, like I don't want to go to a meeting with 25 people,
Right.
right? And these things tend to help you guide your decisions. So I think overall my advice is to listen. If you don't want to hear the negative, it is negative per se, I guess, but if you don't want to hear the negative stuff about what's not working, then you're never going to address it.
Right. If you don't want to see what's really going on, then how can you adjust anything to get the outcomes that you want?
Yeah, and it's
Right.
not what you want to see, and sometimes the revealing of the sort of seamy underbelly of the
Yeah.
organization can be ugly, and it can kind of pull out some warts and make you feel gross, but
Yeah.
you need to see that stuff for what it is.
Yeah.
And sometimes that helps bring clarity into how to address it as well.
Right. It's almost kind of like that something's off in your health. And if you never go to get it checked out to understand
It's probably
what's
not going to get better on its own.
right, what's working, what's not working, or hey, why is this thing happening in this way to me? Like
Right.
why does my ear hurt so much? My ear keeps hurting. No matter what I do, it keeps hurting. All right, if I don't go to try to uncover what I don't know, then how can I do anything? I can't do anything. And
And
not
in that analogy,
yeah.
also creating the space and time to do it, because you're also going to be making trade-offs. I'm not going to go
Yes.
out for drinks with friends, or I'm not going to have that lunch with the coworker today because I need
Right.
to take time to go address this issue. And it's always a cost benefit trade-off, but often those short-term costs lead to long-term benefits like not having permanent damage to your ear.
Exactly. And I love that you used trade-offs as a concept because I even feel like life is a series of trade-offs.
That's
If
all it
you're
is.
that's all it is. It's a constant series of trade-offs. So if it goes back to your analogy of the opportunity cost, right? And the iron triangle. If we are not going to listen and not going to give the space because we need to move fast, okay, what are you trading? You're trading the health of your people systems. You're trading moving fast and not listening to your people for short-term wins that may negatively impact um, your employees to stay longer. Maybe you'll start churning them out more quickly. So there's always a cost. And I love the example also that you gave about how folks feel in the company, and that maybe one of the ways you can measure that is through surveys and it's going down. you might want to address it, but you might not know why. What is it contributing to the sentiment to go down, right? And so you gave the recommendation to listen, to make space or create a mechanism to get feedback, to create the space and time for it, and to crowdsource. And what struck me when you said crowdsource is, yeah, listen to the people, first of all, first and foremost, closest to the pain. If you're talking about something specific in the company, if it's something like overall sentiment, then you got to listen to everyone. You got to crowdsource everyone. But what I noticed also a lot in my experience is that crowdsourcing of information and what to do with it tends to just reside within the HR org
every time.
function or the people org. Like,
And sometimes it's not even clear what to do with it. You get the information and then you
yeah,
just kind of hold on to it and you know it, but you
yeah,
don't necessarily take action on it. And
right.
that's a trap too.
That's a trap. And sometimes the action that's taken is, oh, well, let's do some team building exercises. Okay, well, let's get some folks, some coaches. All right, well, maybe we can do a management training, which may help, right? It may help the situation, but it's not looking at the system. It's not looking at, okay, well, what's really going on and how do we really want to address it so that the entire organization is aligned and is the system itself is being optimized for growth.
If you only ever treat the symptoms and not the root disease, you never solve the problem. You
Yes.
have to dig deeper, so to speak, Inception style, until you get to the roots of the things that are not working. And sometimes you get to ugly answers and ugly decisions. Like
Yeah.
sometimes a specific person isn't working well in a high profile position in the company.
Right.
Sometimes a department's not working well. Sometimes a process isn't working well. Sometimes
Right.
somebody is prioritizing their personal gain over what's best for the company. Like these things happen.
Absolutely.
And addressing them can be tricky as well, because unless you are the CEO or a board member, which most of us aren't, let's face it,
Right.
self included, then it starts to cross beyond the boundaries of your control and influence,
Yeah.
direct influence. And so
Yeah.
then you have to get really good at, like we went all the way back to a tech debt, sales
Right.
pitching,
Yes.
conveying the value of making certain decisions and moves.
Yeah. And that can open up a whole gamut of conversations around how to be influential, how to create, a good pitch, how to communicate, how to disagree, how to have hard conversations, how to let folks go who you like, but aren't necessarily contributing to the outcomes you need to see in an organization. And that whole rich world of topics and issues.
And all those things and more contribute to the debt of the organization.
Absolutely. So what recommendations would you give founders or leaders at startups and scale ups on how to navigate? It sounds like you can't really avoid it. It's something kind of like you said with tech debt, you have to embrace it. So how would they navigate operational debt?
I think it's similar to tech debt guidance. Don't over engineer. Get to a point where you do the minimum possible to solve the problems at hand and then be open to changing it later.
Yeah.
Understand that perfect is the enemy of good and understand that 80% is good enough most of the time.
Yeah.
I think also, again, having those feedback channels, if you're only ever command and control kind of top down ivory tower managing things, then you're never getting the feedback about what's not working.
Yeah.
And one day you wake up and you've got 140% turnover rate at your company and you're wondering what's broken when
Right.
you could have caught it months and months and months ago if you had simply asked people what's not working and created the
Absolutely.
space and trust for that to
Yeah.
happen.
Wonderful. And it also seems like being able to see the good, bad, and the ugly, the things you don't want to see, right?
Be ready to
Be
see
ready.
some stuff.
Yeah. You might
Yeah.
not like. It's like looking in the mirror after maybe not
It's like
brushing
therapy.
your
If you want to
hair.
change yourself, you got to acknowledge the ugly parts and
You
you
got
got
to
to
see
work
what's
on
going
them.
on. What's going
Yeah.
on? Yep.
And it's hard, but it's important. And it's the same for organizations, especially in the American legal context of organizations having the rights of people.
Yeah.
Just like people, they have
Oh,
to
yeah.
debug themselves.
Yeah. Hear that. Any last parting words of advice?
Hmm. There's a lot I could say there, but I would
Yeah.
simply say, again, perfect is the enemy of good, and don't assume you know everything. As much fun as it is to have the power to make decisions, usually the best decisions don't come from one person.
Yeah.
And even though there are high profile individuals in the media who get a lot of attention,
Yeah.
what you don't see is the hundreds, if not thousands, of people working alongside of them to help craft their narrative and shape their ideas. So really your best assets in code and in organizations are people, and make sure that you create lasting relationships with them that create and embrace those uncomfortable, ugly conversations
Yeah.
about what's not working. Because if you don't change anything, nothing ever changes.
Very wise and humbling words,
I do my
David
best.
Haney.
I do my
Thank you
best.
so much. Appreciate
Thank
your
you.
time and insights.
Thanks, Nada, for having me. Super fun. And yeah, hope I see you again sometime soon. Maybe
Yeah.
we'll do another one of these. It'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot, David. I learned a lot, and you really helped me shape my perspective a little bit more. So
Honestly, likewise. Operational debt is something I'll be thinking about for the rest of the week pretty easily.